Thanks for downloading this episode of Cork Talk with me, Tim Atkin. A weekly conversation with some of the most famous people in the world of wine.
This podcast is brought to you in partnership with Noma Cork by Vinventions. Driven by a commitment to innovation, the new plant-based Noma Cork Green Line offers significant improvements in wine closure performance. Thanks to a rigorous oxygen ingress rate, you can decide which cork is best for your wine, whether it's for young and fresh wines or for those with ageing potential.
Auctioneer, author and film producer Andrew Caillard MW has just published The Australian Ark, his magisterial 3-volume history of Australian wine. I caught up with him from Adelaide to talk about the peaks and troughs of the last 236 years, the iconic bottles that make up his canon of Australian wine, old vines, the individuals who've had the greatest impact down under, and his cautious optimism about the future. Hello, Andrew, and welcome to the podcast.
Good afternoon or good evening, Tim. Lovely to speak to you today.
And you're joining us from Adelaide, a hotel room in Adelaide. I'm going to ask, why? What are you doing in Adelaide?
Yeah, it's very rare to be at an Adelaide hotel on a Friday night, but I'm doing this huge charity auction at the University of Adelaide with about 500 people tomorrow night, celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Peter Waite gift or bequest, in which he gave a huge amount of land and quite a lot of money to the University of Adelaide.
Fantastic. Well, we'll get on to the book, the remarkable book, or rather books, because there are 3 of them, the volume, The Australian Ark you've just published. I want to start with a bit of background about you, because as people can hear from your accent, you're a Brit, aren't you? And just where were you brought up, and was wine part of your life growing up?
Well, it was a little bit. I do come from a part English, part Australian background. So my father who's no longer alive today, was English, and he was a serving officer in the Royal Air Force, retiring as an Air Vice Marshal. And he spent his 30 years of his retirement here in Australia. And my mother was actually born in Adelaide. She just turned 92 2 days ago. And she grew up at Ranella. She came from a wine family background, one of the earliest vignerons in South Australia. So I actually, if you like, I'm half English, half South Australian would be an accurate way to describe me.
And you went to school in England, didn't you? But then you went to Roseworthy, right?
Yeah, I did. I went to a place called Worth, which is the current president of the Philippines was at Worth. He was a few years above me, and Bob Deluxe from O'Brien also went there.
Yeah, we know Bob. Yeah,
Prince Bob. But I think he was in the junior school when I was at Worth, so I never really knew him. Yeah,
and you went to
Roseworthy. That's why I've got an English accent, is because
because you went to school there. You went to Roseworthy in the early 80s, didn't you?
Yeah, I did.
You never left really since, have you?
No, well, I have many times, but not for any great length of time. I mean, I've done a lot of kind of travel, but Australia is home and has been since 1982.
And so, do you think of yourself as Australian, or is there still a bit of you that's a Pom?
I'm very proud to be an Australian, but I'm also very proud of my English heritage. Yeah.
I mean, that's amazing how many things you've done with your life. I've forgotten so many things you've done. Auctioneer, you're doing one tomorrow night. Writer, wine buyer, wine judge, very good wine taster. You won the Bollinger Award as an MW student. New product development, film producer, those 2 brilliant films, including the one about the Zimbabwe Soms that came out last year. Consultant. How do you describe yourself now? I mean, you're a bit exhausted, I'd imagine, from doing all
No,
that.
I just call myself a wine expert, really, and it sounds all pretty good, but everything kind of fits in together. As a writer, as an auctioneer, you have to do quite a lot of research, and you land up becoming a writer, and you kind of pushing along an agenda, a fine wine agenda, all that kind of stuff. So you just it's everything kind of fits in together. And the reason why I landed up being involved in new product development is because the company which I was co-founder of, Langton's, which is a kind of fine wine auction house here in Australia, was acquired by Australia's largest retail group called Woolworths. And so I landed up being seconded into their liquor brands, helping them develop new wines, and also help establish an imported range here in Australia. So it was great.
Yeah. And the Langton side of it, you set that up, I think, in 89, and you created this what was then a very revolutionary classification of the best Aussie wines. I
Yeah.
think you're on, the 8th version now? I mean, it was pretty bold at the time, wasn't it? Did people think of Australian wine outside Australia as fine?
Probably not. I think Grange. A lot of people had a real respect for Grange, but not really. Not during the early 80s. And the reason why we started the classification was we were trying to develop a secondary market for Australian wine, and particularly during recessionary kind of times. With the price of Bordeaux and Burgundy and everything was getting out of reach to a lot of people, and so we needed to develop a secondary market for Australian wine. And that's what all the classification was about, was just kind of directing people to the wines that were kind of collectible type of wines.
Yeah, and it succeeded. I mean, I remember, Grange, as you said, by then was pretty famous, but I remember then buying Grange, I'm pretty sure it was under 30 quid at odd bins that would have been in the 80s.
Yeah, it would have been. When I was at Roseworthy, which was 83, 84, I remember buying Grange for under $20 a bottle. So, yeah, absolutely.
It was the same everywhere, was it?
Yeah. It wasn't expensive at all.
Yeah, I wish I'd bought more.
I think the development of an organised secondary market really helped with those, with those types of wines. The same thing with Hill of Grace. So I was involved in a recorking program with Henschke, with old back vintage museum stock that was lying at Henschke in the 90s, and once that was done, there was quite a lot of back vintages of Henschke Hill of Grace that started going into the on-premise market, into restaurants and stuff like that. And suddenly there was more of a focus on Hill of Grace, and so the prices for Hill of Grace doubled in 1 year, and they doubled the following year. And then afterwards, there was this kind of push-pull effect between Grange. The Grange prices went up, Hill of Grace prices went up. And if Grange prices went down, it pushed down the Hill of Grace prices. And I think that dynamic still exists.
How interesting. You spend a lot of your time with fine wine, not just Australian fine wine, but, you're an expert in Bordeaux amongst other places as well. I just wonder what you think it is that makes a fine wine. And is it the same thing as a collectible wine? You just talked a little bit about the fine wine, sort of nascent, as it was in the 80s, sort of fine wine scene in Australia. Tell us about those two things.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting question. I always think of fine wine as conversation wine, a wine that actually stops you and has a conversation. I like that way of describing it because it's not really easy to kind of describe, and everyone's idea of what a fine wine might be slightly different. But of course, and sometimes a fine wine can just be a damn good Côte d'Rhône or something like that. But it stops, and you say, "Bloody hell, this is a great wine for what it is." Collectibles are a completely different thing. Collectibles, really go back into wines you whack into the cellar. You can keep them for a while, and they not only do they improve, and they can be beautiful wines with 20 or 30 years of age, but they also increase in value. And so people, when you're doing that, collecting collectible wines, like with collectible paintings, there is a degree, and I hate the word, by the way, degree of curatorship, when you're putting a cellar together. As an auctioneer, you'd go in and sometimes you'd see these cellars that were just a kind of dog's breakfast. Then others that have been so carefully planned, they're just absolutely wonderful, kind of looking collectible cellars, but not necessarily full of great wines. You necessarily
mine is definitely in the dog's breakfast category, but I'm more or less where things are.
Mine is.
But I don't sell wine on most of it. I buy to drink. Yeah. Just tell us how you've talked a little bit about this. How's the Aussie fine wine scene changed over the last 35 years? And are you surprised by where it is now, given where it was when you did the first classification? Yeah, no,
I think it's quite a difficult, it's kind of going back over 40 years, when I was at Roseworthy Agricultural College. And, I think there were always aspirations that Australia had a fine wine future. And, when we go back to the book, previous generations believed it, and we were achieving it too, during the 1880s and 1890s. So really it was kind of a refreshment, if you like, of, what had happened before. The technology and the ambitions, in the 80s, and the people that I was at Roseworthy Agricultural College with, and, the person who I always think of is Vanya Cullen, and they were just so imaginative. And then people like Mike Davies, who, kind of revolutionized mobile bottling in Australia. All these people I was at college with. And so am I surprised? Well, I think we're all surprised with life and how it evolves. But if I look back at what extraordinary ambitions they had, people like Stefano Lubiano in Tasmania and what he's done, I think that, it is surprising, but then it's also kind of follows the social, political and economic history of Australia. If you look at, the kind of lifestyles that we all live here in Australia, it's a far more sophisticated country than it was 40 years ago, and the wines are as well.
Yeah, but it was still quite English in a sense, wasn't it, 40 years ago? I mean, particularly in Adelaide.
Well, Adelaide was, people used to come and sometimes I couldn't work out whether they were English or whether they were South Australian. But on the other hand, there were quite a lot of English people that actually emigrated to South Australia, as you well know. Yeah. But yes, it's become Australia's changed a lot. It's become, quite focused towards America. And also into Asia, and less so into Europe, and I think our connections as a country with the UK have diluted somewhat, but perhaps they're going to strengthen again, in the next decades to come, perhaps.
Yeah, who knows? I mean, listen, I'll get onto the book in a minute. I just wanted to ask you about these cult wines in the 90s, and you write very interestingly about them in the book. Yeah. You're critical, but you're objective, I think. I mean, many of those wines were championed by Parker, and one in particular, US importer. Have those wines stood the test of time, and were they useful? There was almost an exaggeration of what Australian wine could be at their time.
Well, I think it opened the doors for Australian wine into America, so that was a real positive. And then there's some, kind of winemakers like Chris Ringland, who was the kind of poster boy of the cult wine movement. And over a period of time, he's really kind of regarded as a classical winemaker today. So some of these cult producers became classics, and others just flew into the sun, and the wax melted and they fell away, and we never heard from them again. I mean, that's that's the whole nature. The big problem with the cult wines is that they were fairly high alcoholic, kind of wines, 16% or whatever they might have been. Yeah. And, these were not the wines that the collectors were buying here in Australia. Yeah. And there was a lot of criticism at the time that the wines wouldn't age particularly well, and it proved to be the case. Yeah. And so that was the shame. On the one hand, they were celebrated as young wines, but the people who bought them, I think, are quite disappointed with how many of them evolved. But saying that, a lot of those producers have changed their styles over the years. And it's not the first time where Australia's been criticised for the high alcohols. It was happening in the 1860s in the UK. If you remember, there was a Dr. Thudekum, and he was accusing, Australia of manipulating the wines and saying you couldn't get up to 15.5 or 16% naturally. Well, you can in Australia. Yeah. And
he'd obviously never been there, right?
He was proven to be wrong.
He'd not been there, presumably.
No, of course not. No.
Let's talk about the book. When did you have the idea?
I didn't. I didn't really have an idea. This is the amazing thing about it. There was a vigneron called Dr. Max Lake. You'll remember.
I remember Max Lake. Yeah, very well.
Max, he was a hand surgeon and of American, kind of descent, and he established a winery called Lake's Folly, and he was a really interesting character. Yeah. And wrote a most beautiful book called Classic Wines of Australia. And I read through it, and I kind of really loved it, and thought when I was an auctioneer that I would update it. So I started writing this, kind of revision, if you like. And after I'd got to about 15 or 20,000 words, this is when, the kind of shit hit the fan with Langtons, and, with the acquisition and all the stuff I had with Stuart Langton, and it was not a very nice time. So I kind of shelved it. But saying that, I always kind of had a viewpoint about history. And then I landed up doing the 7th edition of the Penfolds Rewards of Patience. Yeah. And I did a history on that. And then I landed up doing a history on Coonawarra, history on Mornington Peninsula, histories on all sorts of different wines. And then I kind of, and then I was working with the previous classification of Australia of Langtons, and thinking this classification needs to be steeped in our early colonial histories, And so that's really how it all happened. So it was kind of almost not a sticky plaster approach, but it was almost like kind of just going for a walk and not really knowing when the end point was, and not really even thinking about how it was going to be published. Yeah. And this is where the great Angus Hewson comes in, when I, kind of met him at a Grange celebration. And I was telling him, about this thing I'd written. And I said I was frustrated about the fact I had a publisher, but I wasn't really quite sure about it because I felt that I needed more control. And he said, well, why don't we do it together? And so that's what we did. And we raised...
When was that?
2021 must have been. And so we sent out 22 emails to friends, family, and wine people. And I think in about 2.5 weeks, we raised $320,000. And then over the following year, we raised another $300,000. And then we were well advanced in terms of the editing and the picture editing, layout and design and everything. So everyone could see that it wasn't say, well, I'm going to write it. Everyone knew it had been written. And there was a lot of revisions.
He's written most of it already, or lots of it already, with other books.
Yeah, that's right. And so it was really, when we started, fundraising, I had already finished the first draft. So it was done and everyone could see it. So it wasn't like, oh yeah, well, you might do it or you might not do it. It was a reality. And then we did some pre-sales before the launch, and so it's landed up being a $1 million project. And it's been a wonderful journey, but it's been a very stressful one because even though we've raised all this money, there's a little bit of a funding gap, which we'll get to where we need to go. It's not
buy the book, folks. Yeah,
buy the. It's a not-for-profit project, and there's no author's fee. The whole thing about it is, kind of for the greater good. Yeah,
that's great.
Yeah.
And did you do all the research yourself, or do you have a team helping?
Everything. There's no team involved in anything. It's all my research and all my writing. Obviously, with an editor, they might swap around a sentence or something like this. That's how that works as a writer, but. Every writer needs a good editor. And I had an editor and I had a couple of sub-editors. So, I had a whole team of people behind me, analysts, historians, archivists and all sorts.
And you'd show them the stuff you'd written, would you?
Well, yeah. So Volume 1 is a really good example because, I've become a historian. I'm not really a trained historian, all right? And there were some elements, it was right, but just some of the descriptions weren't quite right, descriptions of, Captain Cook, who was actually Lieutenant, Cook, at the time. And these little kind of small little details that, you can really look a bit silly if they're not done properly. And then the other side, of course, was the Aboriginal side of things, the First Nations, and we need to get that right. So we had this marvelous historian called Dr. Stephen Gapp, who read through the whole text and made some, kind of suggestions and really helped me to make sure that side of things was done properly and respectfully.
And which you do very well, I think. The whole book is wonderful, but
it's the right thing. It's the right thing to do. I mean, if you kind of look at the plight of the Aboriginal people, it's absolutely heartbreaking, and you can't not feel emotional and sad about a lot of things. But the other side of the coin also is that there were a lot of colonial Australians who had marvelous ambitions and they were very decent people. And I'd like to think my forebears who arrived in South Australia in 1838, 2 years after the formation of the province of South Australia, were very decent people. And, for everything I've read, I think they were. And they really did believe, in the future of Australia. And a lot of them went off, to Europe to fight in the First World War because they believed in the British Empire and they didn't come back. And my great grandfather was one of them. He was killed at Gallipoli, and he had huge dreams for the winery at Ranella. And there was even a beautiful poem about his dreams that were never realized. So, it's a very, very emotional, and romantic story, the whole thing about Australian wine.
But it's a history of Australian wine, but it's also a kind of a compendium or maybe an encyclopedia, and these fascinating entries on other things along the way, American rootstocks, famous Roseworthy graduates, old vines. And I love that, dipping in. I suddenly think, that's interesting. I'm going to read that bit now. How did you come up with the structure of the book, that particularly the way you keep folding things into the book? And was the idea?
Well, part of it was going right back to the original idea about what the book would be, and that was its Classic Wines of Australia, kind of updated, Max Lake's thing, and that remains in the book as the Canon of Australian wine, and so the Canon of Australian wine is a list of important or waypoint or wines that kind of told the story of Australian wine, bottle by bottle, and that's what that one is. And so it's integrated. So you've got all these different things happening. You've got the narrative, then you've got the Canon of Australian wine going through because everything's done by date, right? Yeah.
And so then each wine is sort of sprinkled through the book, isn't it? Which is lovely,
right,
I think. As well.
And the same thing with important vineyards when they were actually established. One of the fascinating things about Australian wine is the number of surviving 19th and early 20th century vineyards in Australia. It's absolutely phenomenal. I don't think people really fully realize it. In fact, Sarah Abbott, who's of the Old Vine Conference, I think was slightly, kind of taken, back by the list of all these. It's 16 pages of vineyards that exist. And
not even Spain can match that, can it? No. Spain was hit by phylloxera, and South Australia still hasn't had phylloxera, has it?
It hasn't had phylloxera, although it did have a scare in the 1870s. But no, it hasn't arrived, and one wonders when it will happen.
Tell us about the time spans of the three books, because the first one, Colonial Wine, is 1788 to 1900, obviously 1788 for obvious reasons. Yeah. Then the next one is 1901 to 1982, the Federation to the Modern Era. And then the last one is Contemporary Times, which is 1983 to 2023 or 2024, I suppose, in a way. How did you decide on those dates apart from the beginning point and the end point?
Yeah, so it does start from 1788, but if you read the story, the preface and everything like that, it actually goes back into the, to come to the 1770s or even the 1760s, because a lot of the early colonial vine stock material, everyone said, it came from the Cape Colony, but it also came from the Canary Islands, from Madeira, and it also came from England. There were vineyards.
I was really interested in that bit.
There's Paynes Hill Vineyard, and there's Croom Park, and you had all of these, kind of stately homes and their, arboretums and their vineries and all of that kind of stuff. And so you could pick up cuttings. And so Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier came out to Australia very early on. So it does start a bit earlier than that. So 1788, of course, is when New South Wales is settled.
The first fleet arrives.
With the first fleet, and 1900 is an obvious endpoint because it's the end of the 19th century, and also the last year of being a colony, because 1901 was coincide federation with also the death of Queen Victoria. And so we go into another area which is really going into more modern type of thinking. And of course, the First World War and the Second World War are, kind of fairly major, kind of things that happen, during that volume. And it finishes in 1982. And the reason why we did that is because I was educated in the UK and having a father that was in the Royal Air Force, living in Malta and America and Germany and, going to boarding school and all that kind of stuff. But when I came out to Australia to study at Roseworthy Agricultural College, I started at Roseworthy in early 1983. And it just seemed like a good point to start because my whole perspective of Australian wine actually starts in 1983. And so Volume 3 is a very different book to Volume 1 and 2. Volume 1 and 2 are straight kind of histories, whereas Volume 3 has, I would never call it a memoir because that would be a very arrogant thing to do. I don't think my own history is particularly interesting. But I knew a lot of these people. I knew them all. And so I was able to give a little bit of a description of the people. And this idea was actually helped by a friend of mine called Warwick Ross, who I made Red Obsession with and Blind Ambition. And he said, don't be afraid to do that because people will be quite interested in that.
I mean, I certainly was.
We were a bit worried about it. Angus was a bit worried about it too. But in fact, I think it kind of works because people understand it's a history in progress rather than a history volume 3, I think.
I love looking at some of those old photographs of people I've known like you for decades with their haircuts and their shorts and things like that. I just wondered, you're talking about people because it is a people book. I think even the old stuff has got some real characters in it. If you had to name, I don't know, 3 or 4 heroines of Aussie wine over the century, or even 5, would they be the kind of obvious names like James Busby, Max Schubert, or someone a bit very interesting in the book, William MacArthur? I didn't know about William MacArthur. Or Pam Dunsford or someone like that. Yeah.
So William MacArthur is one of my favorite characters in the whole story. He's such an amazing person, and it's really interesting if you go into things like the Australian Dictionary of Biography. They describe him in this kind of character that I just completely don't understand. This is one of the most enlightened, kind of gentleman scientists in the world. He was in correspondence and knew and dined with Charles Darwin when he was the commissioner for New South Wales on the 1855, Paris exhibition. He corresponded with all the great scientists and families of the time. They were immensely wealthy. He and his brother sponsored James Busby when he went off to go and collect all the vines, and of course in the 1830s. And the reason why they sponsored him was because John MacArthur, who's better known for his involvement in the Rum Rebellion in 1808, after he managed to get himself exonerated, he took his sons James and William to France to go and pick up vine stock. And in fact, on their way, they saw Napoleon Bonaparte arrive in Paris with his 100 days, out of Elba, and then of course as the Battle of Waterloo was looming, they slipped off into Vevey in Switzerland, waited out the danger, and then went back down to the south of France and collected vines. But the problem was, when they went back to England, they gave a nurseryman the vines to look after as they prepared to go back to New South Wales on a convict ship, and they built this greenhouse and everything to put all this vine stock and plant material and everything like that. And then when they arrived in New South Wales, they planted the vines at Camden Park, west of Sydney. And 3 years later, when they got their crop, they realized that the vines that they thought they'd collected weren't there at all. They were just the same things you could that were already in Australia. And I know. So it was absolutely disaster.
Maybe give us 3 or 4 other heroes, just quickly.
So William is really, for me, is the parent. Then there's another fellow called Peter von Bourgogne, he was an Englishman that really developed the export market for Australia and was selling something like 15% of all wine sold in the UK, and it was all Empire wine, most of it Australian.
This was in the
1880s and 1890s, right into the 1900s. All this ferruginous red wine that was being prescribed by doctors for their health-giving properties. Can you imagine if we had that happening today? That would be so cool.
You got 3 more.
And then Pam Dunsford. Pam Dunsford, I think, is a very good one because she really represents the very beginning of women working in wine. Beyond, women were always working in wine beforehand, by the way, and that's shown in the volumes. But Pam was really the beginning of kind of modern women working in wine. And she had to endure quite being in the infectious diseases ward at Roseworthy College. And
I love that thing. Sorry, quickly to interrupt. Where she had to promise at her interview that she'd wear trousers.
Yeah, well, that was a practical thing, and it all sounds so absurd, but for the times it was really practical. Yeah. So having
3. One more.
Well, just quickly with Roseworthy, if you just look at the kind of, because I lived there, the infectious disease ward had an adjoining bathroom. It was as simple as that. But anyway, she was fantastic. Brian Croser would be my other one, who I think has been, when you just think of his contribution to technology, winemaking philosophy, distinguished vineyard sites, politics. I mean, he's still out there, and I think he's an amazing character. One of the greats, absolutely one of the very, very great people in wine.
Yeah.
And then Vanya Cullen, who I talked about beforehand, she was doing, organic and biodynamic before it became fashionable, and everyone thought she was a nutcase. Well, look where she is now. I mean, she really was a pioneer and a visionary, and she's making the most beautiful wine still. I mean, she's still active as a winemaker.
I agree with that. But the book is also a kind of immigrant story in a way. They played a huge history and a huge role in the history of Australian wine. I just wonder which has had the greatest impact. The Brits, obviously at the start, Germans, the Silesians, Italians. I mean, a bit of all three. I mean, others, French winemakers, more than immigrant.
A lot of French. So initially, a lot of Germans. I mean, you've just got to remember very early on in the piece, when New South Wales was first settled. Britain was at war with France, and for 20 years, and so not much was happening with France. But Germans, yes, I mean, there were a lot of Germans that were brought out to New South Wales to work in the vineyards up in the Hunter Valley and also down in Camden Park, and Riesling first came into Australia in 1838 alongside a whole lot of vignerons from the Markerbrunner vineyard in the Rheingau. But they nearly mutinied, and they had to be persuaded to get on the bloody ship and come out. And that some of those families still, kind of live in Australia. The Stein family in Mudgee are an example. And I was in an interview the other day, and somebody in Tasmania said it was a relative of one of these people. And then, of course, the Germans were down in Albury Wodonga, which is on the Victorian New South Wales border. And they were a little bit involved in Rutherglen as well, but mostly north there. And then, of course, in South Australia with the Barossa Valley, the Silesians, as you mentioned, I mean, they had a profound impact on the culture of South Australia. And
the terrible time they had in the First World War, really.
They did had a terrible time with the Germanisation of place name, one which was Klemzig, which thank God is still called Klemzig, because they changed the name, would you believe, to Gaza.
No.
And, you just think, it's just kind of mind-boggling. But if you look at kind of towns like Birdwood, Birdwood was named after General Birdwood. There were a lot of towns named after generals. There was another one, you might know, Dorian in the middle of the Barossa.
Yeah.
And that was named after a First World War general. It's very complicated, but it's very sad, actually, a lot of those stories.
Italians? What about the Italians? Not forget the Italians.
Yeah, well, the Italians were really, really started to, in a meaningful way, really from the 1920s onwards, really after the First World War. I mean, of course, there would have been Italian, we had everybody, Italians, at Yandoit in central Victoria, planted vineyards, and they still survived from the 1860s. Yeah. So, they were Italians that were around because of the gold rush that started in the 1850s. Everybody, had a spade or a shovel, came out to Australia to try their luck. I mean, this was the richest country in the world at the time. But the Italians really after the 1920s, like the De Bortoli family, and there are a lot of very great great Italian kind of wine families that are around, which is kind of wonderful. But the French were also very, very important from the very earliest days. I mean, the first, kind of contracted winemakers, one was called Philip Schaefer, who was German, but there were a couple of prisoners of war who were probably languishing in a hulk in the Thames that were persuaded, who said they were winemakers and say, well, you can come out to New South Wales. And in fact, last night, I was talking to actually a friend of Angus's called Rachel, who was saying that one of her forebears was one of these original French guys.
Wow.
They basically bullshitted their way to New South Wales. And although it was pretty bleak living, it was a lot better than living in a hulk. But there were a lot of French people that came in, and particularly with the development of sparkling wine during the 1880s and 1890s, there were a lot. There was people like Edmund Mazur, Charles Gély, who was who worked at Beaumont and then at Chadderton Under, and landed up marrying the daughter of Edmund Mazur, I think it was, and another guy called Jean-Pierre Trouet, who founded kind of Great Western. There are a lot of French people. The French influence on Australian wine is pretty profound, actually.
But it's interesting you're talking about this. I think you call it the golden period, don't you, in the 1880s and 90s? Yeah. And that would surprise many people that Australian wine didn't start in the 1980s, right? I mean, what went wrong between that and the famous Monty Python sketch, Sydney Syrup and Chateau Chandra? Things. I mean, what happened to Australian wine between that golden moment and then when it was reborn, really, in the 80s? I mean, the 1980s.
It was the First World War. It was the First World War that did it. The whole export market, came to nothing. And then after the First World War, in 1924, the Export Bounty Act was introduced, which encouraged winemakers pivot from making table wines to fortified wines to compete against the cheap Portuguese and Spanish fortified wines, and we just lost our traction. I mean, when you think about the ambitions, early forefathers believed that Australia would be the France of the Southern Hemisphere, and there's a 1924 Camden Park Red Burgundy, that was described as the first growth and the purest of and the finest wine you could ever buy, or whatever it was, and then. And then there was a Brush Farm Claret that was actually made out of Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier that won the first gold medal at the Society of Encouragement of the Arts.
When was that?
Well, basically the Royal Society in around 1828, 1830.
Amazing.
So, the ambitions, were just completely derailed. And then, so really between the interwar years, Australia was making a lot of very nice table wines, but just for the local market. But in Europe and the UK particularly, everyone forgot all of these incredible wines that were being sent into the UK during the 1880s and 1890s and were really well loved.
I mean, I remember would have been about 1986 or 7, going as a very young journalist, being sent to Australia House to interview somebody who was the new, trade councillor or something. And they had just decided to put £100,000 marketing behind Australian wine. And they thought this was enormous. And it was considered a risk that Australian wine, this would be 1986 probably, was just beginning. And it was the time of Hazel Murphy. And the UK played a big part in that, didn't it?
Yeah, they did. But it's interesting because also, if you remember, the Australian Wine Centre was in Soho and it was between two sex shops. I mean, it's not really a great place to kind of promote your fine wine credentials, is it?
Next to a sex shop.
Yeah. So, I mean, and that thing about the Monty Python thing, that really, really annoyed me when that came out. I felt really. I think that put back Australia's fine wine aspirations by at least a decade. And funnily enough, the whole transcript of that. We weren't allowed to put into the book, which I wanted to put in. Well, I think because of its reference to and all that kind of stuff. I think they're just it's outdated and it was of its time. They want to move on. And in fairness, I think that I'm probably pretty happy it's not in there anyway.
Yeah, I think so. But listen, I want to ask you about the future because we could talk for hours, but I could talk to you for another hour about this. It's such a great book. One of the things you say, and I think this is very true, you say the story of Australian wine proves that the future is the enduring reference. I mean, the Aussies are great optimists. They can do people as a rule. Yeah. And there have been these massive peaks and troughs over the centuries you talk about in the volumes. Yeah. What are the challenges, the biggest challenges right now? And I just wonder how optimistic you are about the future. I mean, there's some big challenges, aren't there?
Yeah, there are some big challenges. But if you look back again through history, you can see that those challenges can be overcome. And I am very, very positive. I think Australia's kind of foray into, kind of commercial wine, particularly from the irrigated inlands, it was a good thing perhaps to do during the 80s and 90s. But, now with, severe, kind of water shortages, and not that we think we'll have any right now, but, just in the long-term trends, really, premiumization is the way that we need to go. And we've been talking about it for years and years and years. It's just that in many respects, the shit has hit the fan. And so, we're having to kind of recalibrate and restructure. So, there are going to be families that lose out, but there will be other families that will win. But I think I feel pretty confident, that like climate change is a really interesting concept, because hand in hand with that is sustainability and, all of those things about epigenetics, with vines and how they adapt to the climate, and then climate mitigation. There's more work going into the, kind of soil health, kind of vine health and all of that kind of stuff than ever before. And then you've got things like sunscreens and stuff like that are also, kind of might help one way or the other, basically chalk-based natural products. So I think with all those challenges comes innovation and creativity. And I think that's the great thing about Australian wine. So the tariffs of, the kind of that were put on by the Chinese on Australian wine, which was devastating and really kind of basically pulled the plug on Australian wine and it's caused a lot of this kind of problem. Those tariffs have been taken off now. And I don't think Australian wine will get back to where it has been for a long while. But there'll be some brands like Penfolds that, in theory will come back just simply because of their luxury brand image and all of that kind of stuff. So I feel quite confident about that. I just feel that Australian winemakers are just so imaginative and adaptive and optimistic, and will try things, and I feel very confident. The one thing that really worries me is urbanization, and the way that politicians and developers go hand in hand, and they basically kind of allow very valuable vineyard land to be destroyed. And I think that's the biggest threat to Australian wine that we have, rather than climate change.
And the other fine wines have go on, Kerry.
So I mean, urbanization. When I look at Ranella, my mother's family's pile that used to go all the way down to the ocean. It's just an endless kind of horizon of packing case style houses. On these very, very small blocks of land. And then every new owner of Ranella has just basically cut it up and destroyed a valuable part of Australia's wine history. And we've got to prevent this from happening generally, I think.
But the future's bright. I think and as you said, the fine wines have never been better, have they?
Well, that's what I think. I genuinely think about it. But there's another thing. Australians. And if you listen to Australians go on in politics and parliament, everyone seems to be at each other's throats. Australians seem to really enjoy putting all their dirty washing out into the public. And so there's a lot of dirty washing going on about the Australian wine industry, where people say you should be doing this, and there's some critics saying we're not making wine as good as we did in the past. Well, it's all bullshit. Of course we're producing better wines than we've ever been producing, because technology and all of those things are brilliant. And we will definitely overcome these challenges.
We shall overcome. Listen, Andrew, it's been amazing talking to you. We could talk for hours. It's such a great book. I mean, it really is. 3 volumes, guys, available in the UK and around the world. Académie du Vin is £200 in the UK. Well worth buying. I mean, there's a massive amount of work gone into it, and they're beautifully illustrated maps. I mean, I don't think anybody's ever going to better this book. So, you can have that as your epitaph, I think.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
It's been brilliant talking to you. Good luck with the auction tomorrow night. And I hope we'll see each other very soon to share a good bottle of wine.
Good. Thank you so much, Tim. Cheers.
Yeah.
Bye.
There's so much in those 3 volumes that Andrew and I could have chatted for another hour or two. Do buy the book, because it's truly brilliant. Next week on Cork Talk, my guest is Giuseppe Vaira from GD Vaira in Piemonte. Join me then. Thanks for listening to Cork Talk. If you want to read more reports, articles and tasting notes by me, go to my website, timatkin.com. You can also follow me on Twitter @TimAtkin and on Instagram @TimAtkinMW. See you next week.